Hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the general election, what to expect and how to prepare for it. We like to think that we have read the manifesto so you don't have to, although we do have to start with a disclaimer that we haven't read, despite the front cover, the manifesto of the monster-raiding Looney Party, largely because they don't have one. Joining me today are Paul Callahan in our employment team. Paul is a partner of that team who's been advising in relation to employment issues for many years, and also Mark Owen, who is a partner in our IP team, who's going to talk about intellectual property issues today. My name's Rosalind Connor. I'm a partner in our pensions team, and I'm going to be talking about pensions issues. So I'm starting really by talking about the big change that has just happened in relation to pensions, which is viewed by many as very political and very influential on the upcoming election. And I'd like to start, if I may, by asking your first polling question. It would be great to get as many answers as we can. So I'm going to ask the question now and offer you an opportunity to answer it over the next minute. The question is, do you think that the change George Osborne has introduced to how you can take your pension at and after retirement, what he refers to as a new freedom and choice, that means that you don't have to buy an annuity, affect how you intend to vote this time next week? If you could put a yes or a no and then click the submit button at the bottom right-hand corner, please don't forget to do that because otherwise it won't register. That would be great. We still have about 30 seconds remaining to that. But in the meantime, I'm going to run on with a little bit of explanation in that particular area. So, what has George Osborne done? Well, the easiest way to understand this is to understand what was there before. Prior to the 6th of April this year, if you had a defined contribution pension, the pension fund could be taken as follows. You could take up to 25% of it as a tax-free lump sum, immediately retired, and then you had a choice. You could either buy an annuity. Now, an annuity is a product, it's an insurance product, by which you pay a lump of money, and in response you get an income for life, depending on how long your life is. You may make money or lose money on that. It's subject to a number of restrictions. You can't have an annuity that starts for a large amount and then gets smaller, but there's a lot of flexibility within it. It's generally perceived as poor value, although actuaries who are the experts in how long we're all going to live don't tend to take a view that it necessarily is of poor value, but instead will say that people underestimate their life expectancy. So it's good news, you're going to live longer than you think. But bad news is you may not be able to pay for it. You could choose, instead of buying an annuity, to draw down your pension, which effectively said you will take your pension pot, leave it where it is, and take some of it from time to time. There were two different ways you could draw down. You could either draw down up to a limit each year, called capped drawdown, or you could make sure that the pot of pension retained enough to buy an annuity of an appropriate level, the level set by the government, and draw down all the rest, however and whenever you want to. You could, instead of any of these options, take the whole of your pension as a lump sum if it was less than £12,000, or if the whole of your pension in all the pension pots you have ever, anywhere, are less than £30,000, you could take that as a lump sum. The reason why these mattered is that if you didn't do that, if you tried to take your pension any other way, above the limits you were allowed, it costs you a tax charge of up to 55%, which is there purely because pensions are seen as tax efficient, and if you're not going to buy a pension with them, then you're going to be charged the tax for failing to do so. In addition, if you kept your funds in your pension and you didn't start taking them, perhaps because your pension was an amount of money you didn't need right now and you thought you might like to leave it to your dependents, then very clearly the government didn't want you to do that because funds retained on your desk generally was also subject to a tax charge of 55%, making it terribly unpopular. The changes that came in on the 6th of April, which were something of a revolution, is that this lump sum continues in the same way, but instead of having all these restrictions, you either could take an annuity of any kind with no restrictions at all as to the type of annuity. You could continue to take cap drawdown, but the flexible drawdown has been turned into something much simpler. Effectively, you can take any amount at any time, not subject to any restrictions. And instead of doing any of that, you could just take your money in lump sums over time and just pay tax on 75% of it, i.e. you get your 25% tax-free in bits every time you took some money. So this means you no longer have to keep money for your retirement. You can save in your pension and then take it all. As the Pensions Minister, Steve Webb, somewhat passive-aggressively said the day after this was announced in the budget last year, you could, of course, just go and buy a Lamborghini with it if you wanted to. The point being made that if you buy a depreciating asset or an asset that you're going to wrap around a tree, then that is not going to provide you with an income in your old age. It's available from age of 55 or 50 for some people, for everybody. And in addition, and these are the changes that have happened since last year, if any fund that's left for your dependents after you die, if instead of them taking a lump sum, they take a drawdown again, they just get charged as if they were taking income under their normal income tax basis. So in fact, if you're leaving to that someone who isn't an income tax payer, as long as you keep the number below the income tax band, so at about £10,000, no tax gets paid by anyone on it. I wanted to mention, just from the point of view of the fact that many of us employ people and have to worry about these changes, what is it that an employer has to do in these circumstances? Well, there are a number of obligations. The most important one is a requirement to signpost to employees this new free advice that's being provided at retirement. Now, I say advice because that was the word George Osborne used in his budget speech last year, but in fact, by the time the document came out of the Treasury 2 hours later, it no longer said advice, it said guidance, because advice has a particular technical legal meaning, effectively meaning financial advice that is given by a financial advisor who is regulated usually by the Financial Conduct Authority. So this is now guidance. It's going to be 20 minutes. It's going to be free, which means it's being paid for by the financial services industry, not by the individual or their employer. But it's 20 minutes of advice. It's not going to give you very much. What the people providing this guidance, which is now called PensionWise, have said is that really it's just going to explain to you what the words mean, explain to you the jargon and the concepts, not do the thing that everyone wants from their financial advisor, which is give you some idea of what you should do. Now, the effect of that is that if you are an employer, you're just going to get a lot more questions. There will be a lot more learning, and that is a dangerous thing because people don't know enough to really understand, but enough to ask questions, which many people would say is no bad thing. The big effect of this is that employers have to be extra careful not to give advice in these circumstances. They're not authorised to do so. Giving advice when you're not authorised may be a criminal offence under the Financial Services and Markets Act. So one does have to be incredibly careful. The effect of this is going to be a lot of people asking a lot of people questions, and one has to be very careful what questions are answered. Now, if the employer has an occupational pension plan, that plan doesn't actually have to offer these freedoms if they don't want to, but members can transfer somewhere else to get the freedoms. The trustees of the plan can decide to offer them without asking the employer, even if the setup of the plan usually means they need to. And even though the employer generally pays for this, which seems a bit tough on employers, but not a point people have complained about much yet. There is just a general question for most employers about whether they want these freedoms to be available and whether, as an HR management issue. They want people to take some of their pensions, to continue working, and perhaps discover they don't quite have enough money. I briefly want to mention the changes for defined benefit plans. Defined benefit plans don't have these freedoms. And now if someone is in a defined benefit plan, if they want to move their money to a defined contribution plan, they need to get independent financial advice, which generally they will have to pay for and which will not be cheap. If the employer encourages employees to transfer, then they will have to pay for the financial advice themselves. So employer communications have to be considered incredibly carefully. And again, there is always a concern that if a member makes a transfer and regrets it, particularly if the employer has been encouraging it, whether there is any risk that the member will complain. Litigators will always tell you that the worst people to have suing you are retired people, because they've got an awful lot of time on their hands and nothing else to do all day. So there are always risks attached here. What is interesting about these changes is that they have proved immensely political, and I would say immensely popular to begin with. Whether they stay that way, I simply don't know. And the effect of that is that the parties have all said they will continue them, or have just ignored the subject altogether. Even parties like the SNP, who you would feel were in a position where they felt they could be quite radical, and are generally relatively critical of the Conservatives. When you look at the different parties, they largely say the same thing about pensions. It generally seems to be the case that the Conservatives think they've won this fight by offering these changes. The other parties think that they don't want to go there because they're not going to look good, so they're keeping off the subject. Generally, there have been very little differences at all. Most parties, including the Conservatives and Labour, want to reduce benefits or tax benefits for higher paid workers in relation to contributions to pension schemes. And a lot of parties have talked about trying to make sure that people get good advice on retirement and that they're not subject to scammers who everyone is worried are flooding the industry, phoning up people who have reached retirement to suggest they want to invest largely, it seems, in storage units or car parks. Interestingly, one party has suggested what you want to do is make cold calling people about the investment of their pension a criminal offence. The same party has quite clearly set out how it's going to double the budget for pension-wise, and that's UKIP, which is not anything anyone expected. There are very few parties that have anything different to say. The Greens do, but largely they want to return to the CERP state pension introduced by Barbara Castle in the late 70s, which came to an end in 97. And also the Socialist Labour Party, Socialist Democratic Labour Party, who has suggested that occupational pension schemes should be nationalised. Not quite sure how that would happen, but I'm relatively comfortable, although in this election I don't think you can be comfortable with anything, that they're unlikely to hold the majority in Parliament next week. I looked at the answers to the questions here, and I think it's quite interesting. Actually, 9% of people think that the change that George Osborne announced has affected the way they're going to vote. And this is interesting because you wouldn't expect one policy that in fact was introduced over a year ago to have that effect. A recent poll carried out by one of the pension providers found that 18% of voters felt they would be influenced by George Osborne's changes. And perhaps that is the case, that a lot of people will be influenced in these circumstances. That is everything I wanted to say about pensions, so I'm going to hand over now to Paul, who is going to talk to us about the employment issue.
Thanks, Rosalind. So, employment law, probably one of the most political areas of law, in that generally Labour governments increase employment rights and Conservative governments reduce them. And we've certainly seen a lot of changes during the 5 years of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. Many people might be surprised to know that it was actually the Conservatives in the early 1970s who introduced unfair dismissal in the first place. Before then, we had no unfair dismissal laws, and it was essentially a question of what your trade union could do to protect you if you were under threat of losing your job. But Edward Heath's government introduced unfair dismissal rights, and they did that not necessarily, I don't want to be too cynical, to protect workers, but actually because they thought that by giving individual workers rights, it would take power away from the unions. And perhaps to some extent that has happened. But now that the unions have been tamed, the Conservatives are quite hostile to unfair dismissal for the concept, because they believe it's red tape, business doesn't like it, it's a cost to business, and their argument is that that means that businesses are less likely to hire people because it's harder to fire people. In fact, according to the OECD, the UK has the third most flexible employment laws in the Western world after the US, where they have at-will employment, which means you can hire and fire people at any time for any reason or no reason, and Canada, which also doesn't have unfair dismissal rights. So we're already the most flexible. But during the Conservative Liberal Democrat government, we've seen unfair dismissal hacked away quite significantly. So it used to be that you only needed 1 year's service to bring an unfair dismissal claim. That's been doubled to 2 years. And probably more significantly, the government brought in a requirement to pay fees, and some quite hefty fees, to bring employment tribunal claims. And that has resulted, since fees were introduced about 18 months ago, in a fall in employment tribunal claims of about 80%. Now, if you're business and you had a lot of claims before, you might be quite pleased at that, and the government, the Conservatives anyway, say that that's really good news. That's a sign that their reforms have worked, whereas those on the other side, the Labour Party, say that, well, actually that just means that people don't have access to justice. It doesn't mean that things are going better in the workplace. So the first thing I questioned, if there was a Conservative government or a Conservative-led government, is whether unfair dismissal will be abolished altogether. Because you may be aware that a Conservative Party donor, Lord Beecroft, produced an advisory report for the government at the time they were looking at reforming unfair dismissal, and suggested that unfair dismissal be scrapped completely and a new system of what's called no-fault dismissal to be introduced, where similar to the US system, you could effectively be fired at any time for no reason at all. But unlike in the US, where you'd get no payoff, there would be some sort of statutory formula introduced, so you would automatically get a certain amount of money, probably quite low and probably similar to what we now have for statutory redundancy payments. Now, the Conservatives haven't actually said in their manifestos that they will scrap unfair dismissal. That might be a bit too controversial to put it in there. But what we know is that they wanted to scrap it completely this time round for businesses with less than 10 employees. And it's only the Liberal Democrats who as their coalition partners, stopped them doing that resulted in unfair dismissal rights still existing for employees of those companies if they have at least 2 years service. So I suspect if we have a Conservative-led government and they have the freedom and they have the freedom to make whatever laws they want, that we will see that unfair dismissal is at the very least restricted to those in larger businesses. And what I also suspect they'll do is they will slash the compensatory award, because a lot of people have not noticed that about 2 years ago the government changed the potential formula for how you calculate the maximum compensatory award. At the moment, it's the lower of about £80,000 and one year's pay. But by just a statutory instrument, so nothing else, no new legislation, the government can now change that so that the maximum compensatory award for unfair dismissal would be an average wage in the UK over a year, which is currently around £27,000. So I think it's quite possible, if we have a Conservative-led government, that if there's any unfair dismissal left at all, you will not only have to pay a big fee, but what you can recover would probably be slashed to a maximum of about £27,000. So the Conservatives in the manifesto don't say a great deal about employment law, and that's probably because they're not planning to introduce much more. They want to reduce it. Whereas when we go on to Labour, you'll see that actually if they win, there may well be a lot of new laws. But what they have said, the Conservatives, in fact, that all of the main parties have said, is that for large employers, and that's employers with 250 employees or more, they will be required to produce what's called a pay gap audit to demonstrate the difference in average pay between men in the business and women in the business. What they've also said, the Conservatives, is that they will scrap the Human Rights Act and potentially replace it with a British version. Now, the Human Rights Act, although not directly employment law, whenever an employment tribunal makes a decision, it has to do so by reference to the Human Rights Act. And in the world of employment law, that's probably most relevant in relation to the right that you have to a private life. So that, and the fact that what you do in your private life has to be taken into account by employment tribunals as a protected right in the UK, that could potentially disappear. The other obviously very big thing is that the Conservatives will introduce an in-out referendum in relation to the EU by 2017. And a lot of UK employment law comes from the EU. So if we did leave the EU, all of the existing laws would remain on the statute books, but they would potentially be vulnerable to being repealed. And that includes all of the anti-discrimination legislation. And it might seem improbable that a British government, even a Conservative government, would repeal anti-discrimination laws. But they did actually look, during the coalition government, at capping compensation for discrimination at the same level as unfair dismissal. Because at the moment, it's uncapped. You can get your full losses, which if somebody is highly paid or they're not likely to work again for many years, can be very high. But the government was looking to change that. So I think at the very least, it wouldn't be too surprising if discrimination compensation started to be capped. The TUPE regulations, when you buy and sell a business or you outsource, they come directly from Europe, and so they again would be under threat if we left the European Union. And certainly when they were introduced back in 1981, Margaret Thatcher's then minister, who had to introduce them to the House of Commons, Alan Clark, said that he loathed them. And I suspect the Conservative view of TUPE probably hasn't changed. The one other area that the Conservatives have said they will introduce new laws is in relation to strikes. And you may have seen quite a bit of publicity about this. At the moment, you have to hold a ballot to successfully to have lawful industrial action, and needless to say, that means the majority of people voting have to approve the strike action. And when you go on, when you have a strike ballot, there's a specifically worded statutory question on that ballot paper which talks about, are you prepared to breach your contract of employment, and it's constructed in quite judgmental terms. Well, the Conservatives, if they get re-elected, are committed to requiring a strike to have the support of at least 50% of people eligible to vote. So if it's not just who actually does vote, everyone who doesn't vote is effectively deemed to vote no. So that's the Conservatives. If Labour win, it's a different world. They are committed to scrapping employment tribunal fees, which you may like or you may hate. What they're also proposing to do, though, is reform the whole employment tribunal system. But there's a lot of uncertainty as to what that means. They've said they want to make it more efficient and simple. There is no detail as to what that means. Does it mean employment tribunals are going away completely and there'll be some different form of accessing justice? We just don't know. And that surely would have to be several years off. But that is what they are actually committed to. They've also said that they're going to strengthen the law in relation to maternity leave, so that maternity returners will have a right to have reasonable adjustments made to their jobs on return. So it's a positive obligation. As you may know, at the moment, any employee can request flexible working, and it's probably most common that employees returning from maternity leave will request changes to their hours, for example, or request to work from home some of the time. But the onus is on the individual to make that application, and then there's a process for the company to go through. The Labour Party is proposing to change that, so there's a positive obligation on employers to make reasonable adjustments in the same way as there is when somebody is disabled. More radically and more excitingly, and more disruptively perhaps, the Labour Party is also proposing quite radical action in relation to pay and how pay is determined and published. So for public companies, there's going to be a requirement for either employee representatives or a trade union representative, wherever a trade union is recognised, to be on a remuneration committee, so that the workers effectively have a say in determining pay. And that, as I understand it, is the system that currently exists in Germany, which is a reasonably successful economy. There's also going to be a requirement of businesses, and we don't know whether it's going to be all businesses or whether it's just going to be large businesses, to publish the top 10 salaries in those businesses so everybody can see, which will be quite interesting. Will people actually want to be salary number 11 so that their salary isn't disclosed, or actually will it get competitive and they'll want the world to know that they get paid more than certain colleagues? And also the company will have to publish its ratio of top earnings to average earnings within its business. Now, there was some talk of there being a cap on that ratio of top to average or even top to bottom, but that hasn't made it into Labour's manifesto. There's been a lot of talk about 0 hours contracts. Now, even the Conservatives are committed to ending a requirement in the 0 hours contract, which effectively means you have no guarantee of any work at all, to exclusivity. So, because at the moment, although there's no guarantee of any work, there could be a requirement that you don't work for anyone else. But that is going to be abolished by the Conservatives. Labour is going even further. They're suggesting that if you work regular hours, even if you theoretically have a 0 hours contract, that will become a permanent regular contract after 12 weeks. Obviously, that employers could get around that by potentially changing the hours so that they aren't regular. So we'll see whether there are any anti-avoidance measures in that legislation if that comes to pass. There's also going to be an encouragement to companies to pay the living wage as opposed to the national minimum wage by way of tax relief to companies. Again, we don't know the detail. And there is also a pledge to double the period of paternity leave to 4 weeks. So essentially quite a lot of new stuff which could have an impact on business if Labour were to win. What they haven't said, though, is that they will reverse the Conservative and Liberal Democrats' increase in the qualifying period from 1 year to 2 years to bring an unfair dismissal claim. There's absolute silence on that, although the abolition of employment tribunal fees, if it happens, will I suspect have the biggest impact of all, because then I imagine we'll see a sudden rise in employment tribunal claims again. Now, I haven't really covered the other parties very much, because I think, being realistic, we're going to have either a Conservative-led government or a Labour-led government. It's possible the Liberal Democrats could be in either of those governments. Interestingly, it was Vince Cable as Business Secretary, obviously a Liberal Democrat, who brought in the employment tribunal reform. Though you may have seen that just today he has said that he decided it was a mistake to introduce employment tribunal fees. Well, there you go. You got that wrong. And so the Liberal Democrats have pledged to review employment tribunal fees. What I think that means in practice is that if they do join a coalition with Labour, they won't object to employment tribunal fees being abolished. But if they're back in coalition again with the Conservatives, I think any review is going to result in no change, or even probably raising the fees. And that's really everything that I wanted to say. UKIP, as you may know, have talked about scrapping all discrimination laws, which they wouldn't be able to do until we left the EU. That seems unlikely to happen. And the Greens go further than the Labour Party in increasing employment rights. Again, I suspect they're unlikely to be able to influence these things. But as I say, employment law is one of those areas where it will make a difference whichever way you vote, because the Conservatives will be reducing employment rights, reducing red tape, and Labour will potentially be increasing employment rights and probably making it more likely that employees will bring claims if they feel they've been unfairly treated at work. So that's employment law, and I will now move on to my colleague Mark Owen, who will talk to you about all of the IP issues.
Thanks, Paul. And it's fair to say that IP is probably not the issue which will decide the election, unlike employment or even pensions. Up until recently, IP has never been a very political issue. Throughout the last few years, every political party has been pro everything to do with IP. They're pro the people who create it, they're pro the people who use it, they're pro the technology companies. They like all of it, just at different times. And whenever they're asked what kind of IP policy there should be, they all say, well, it should be fit for purpose, which begs the question of, well, what is the purpose of IP policy? But I think with this election, we're starting to see some slight differences, particularly from the smaller parties who may have an influence. And I think over time we may see more profound changes or gaps between the parties as questions of how international we should be and what is meant by individuals' digital rights come to the fore. I'm going to start off with a polling question, which is, at the moment, quite a lot of our IP laws come straight out of Brussels, and although we've had UK laws, they've largely had to adapt or fall into line with Brussels EU laws. Should all IP laws be decided by Brussels? And I'll leave you a little time to answer that one, and then come back to it. And I think that does touch on a question which is essentially quite important. Paul said it's unlikely that we'll be leaving the EU, and that may well be right, but should the Conservatives come back into power, then they have promised a referendum about whether to leave the EU, and one area that would be profoundly affected were we to leave the EU would be IP rights and what happens about those. And so, although you may think that UKIP doesn't have much that's necessarily of interest to you, on something like this, I think they have quite a profound effect, potentially. We'll come back to that. So, what do all the parties say about IP rights? All of them, pretty much, or at least all the ones that I've read the manifestos, and I have read many of the manifestos now, all of them do say something about IP, which is a change. All of them, like I say, are still largely pro-IP, but there are nuances between how they approach it. IP has become more political, as I say, in the last few years. The very last bill of the previous government was an IP bill that was rushed in by the Labour government about digital rights enforcement under the Digital Economy Act, and that was criticised roundly by the Conservatives at the time. The one IP policy they're now supporting in their manifesto is supporting the sort of things which were being dealt with by that legislation, namely making it easier for rights owners to get orders blocking infringing websites and supporting voluntary anti-piracy projects. I mean, there are some differences between that and the previous policy, but nevertheless, the direction of travel is similar. They also say in the manifesto, quite interestingly, we'll work to ensure that search engines do not link to the worst offending sites. And it may be that marks a bit of a change of approach. One of the most headline-grabbing things in the IP world that this current government did was David Cameron announcing a review of copyright laws, which was said by many people to be favouring US technology companies. And it now appears that the Conservative Party has started to go back to the other side and not being seen as simply pro-technology and not necessarily worrying about rights owners. Interestingly, in the last couple of days, 90 leaders of big tech city companies have signed a letter effectively supporting the Conservative Party. So the Conservative Party is still obviously very pro-technology and is proud of what's happened with things like the patent box tax mechanism. Labour says less, in a way, or less specific in its manifesto. It says it wants to build on UK strengths, blah, 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 and get government data to be open. it has said in comments to journalists that it does have a long-term vision for IP, and it wants IP reform not to be piecemeal, which was a criticism which has been made a number of times about previous governments, not just this government, but the previous government as well, that IP is one of those things that's very convenient for a politician to pick up and say, oh, we really must do something about this, and come up with some little bit of reform rather than changing the whole environment. What that will mean in practice, we'll yet to see, because when we come back to the question, so many of our laws are decided in Brussels, and what really can any party do. One thing Labour does come out strongly in favour of is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is as people I'm sure know, a large trade agreement that's being negotiated now between the EU and the US, and we'll come back to that, because that is one of the areas which I think is very political, and is one, although it's not just about IP, it has important implications for IP. The Lib Dems support a modern and flexible patent, copyright and licensing rules, which is a bit like saying, well, it should be fit for purpose. Modern and flexible, what does that mean? Possibly it means that there should be more freedom to do things online. That may be the subtext. They also want a digital bill of rights for individuals. That's probably, although they don't really elaborate, that's probably to do with things like data protection more than it is to do with the right to use your content wherever you want, whenever you want. But it may be. Certainly there is a lot of support for consumers having more rights to use content. They also, one of the few parties that come out about net neutrality, which is the whether or not telcos should be able to prioritise certain types of traffic if it's being paid for, or if it's people they've got relationships with, rather than letting any kind of web traffic through. They're also pro the TTIP. UKIP are, perhaps unsurprisingly, anti the Transatlantic Trade Agreement, and obviously that goes with them being anti the EU. If UKIP prevails and we had Brexit, in other words, British exit from the EU, then there would have to be a massive rejigging, I think, of our IP laws, particularly our copyright law, our trademark law, our design law, to some extent our patent law, are all creatures of European laws. And if we moved apart, then we'd have to say which of those we'd stick with and which we wouldn't, and to what extent. So I think potentially it would have a very profound effect. And it would also make it harder and more expensive for rights owners to enforce their rights internationally. The SNP actually does have a legitimate IP owner as one of its leading lights, Pete Wishart, who is one of their MPs, ex-Big Country band member, so the people old enough to remember Big Country. And they haven't actually said anything about IP in their current manifesto, but when they had a referendum, they said a lot about it. And they mainly said, well, we would like something pretty much like the rest of the UK's got, but obviously it'd be cheaper and better. So although they said a little bit, they didn't really explain how they would do it. So I don't expect there'll be much change to IP policy were the SNP to hold the balance of power, which of course is possible. When we get to the smaller parties, we start to see more differences. The Green Party, to the extent they may hold the balance of power, one of the things they may try and do is profoundly affect copyright law. At the moment, copyright is protected for the life of the creator plus 70 years, so in other words, to pay that creator and the next generation of their family. The Green Party wants to limit that. They said, or it was reported they were saying a 14-year copyright term totally. They've now clarified that to say a life plus 14-year, but they're now already reconsidering it, having only mentioned it a couple of weeks ago because they've had so much criticism from rights owners about, well, what's all that about? They also are against software patents, which would reduce the protection of a lot of the large software companies, and they're anti the Transatlantic Trade Agreement. Scottish Socialists, I'll come back to shortly, and then finally there's the Pirate Party, who, again I'll come back to because they're more prevalent in Europe, but they are against copyright in many forms and want to roll it back. One area not really talked about at all, although it was talked about in our invitation, was trademarks, and that's not to say that trademarks aren't important, they're just as important as ever, but none of the parties have got anything to say about them. In other words, I think they agree with the current system and would like to change it. It's difficult to be controversial about trademarks. trade secrets is an area of controversy, particularly for a Scottish socialist, but actually among many people who are against the transatlantic trade partnership. Up until this point, trade secrets have been a source of law that has been different country by country across the EU. Different types of things are protected as trade secrets in different ways. And the EU, partly because of international obligations, partly because it thinks it would be good for trade, has proposed a harmonisation of that under the Trade Secret Directive. This has become, although it's been talked about now for a couple of years, it's become very controversial as to how far it'll go and how far it'll allow things like whistleblowers and freedom of expression. Although there are going to be exceptions within it, there is concern that it's going to make it easier for, in the words of some journalists, big business to control what's said. I mentioned there a couple of things which are important to debate. Ironically, LuxLeaks, which is the investigation of the Luxembourg Parliament or government for giving tax breaks to certain companies, there are a couple of people who leaked information about that, and they're being prosecuted by the Luxembourg government. The question is, would they actually be protected by the law which Mr. Juncker, who is the commissioner and was also the Prime Minister of Luxembourg at the time, introduced, or was planning to introduce. That's one to watch. I'll just give you briefly on the next slide what it does, so you've got it for future reference. It's going to define what a trade secret is. Pretty similar to what we've already got in this country: confidential information with commercial value, and which the owner must have made a reasonable effort to keep confidential. There are going to be quite permitted acts or exceptions to it which are going to need defining. So you can do anything which is in conformity with honest practices. You can do anything to protect a legitimate interest. At the moment, no one's really sure how far they will go. And as I say, there's discussion and controversy over things like freedom of expression and whistleblowing. Perhaps much more controversial and perhaps the biggest area around IP that attracts political debate is copyright. And copyright was the area that Gordon Brown chose when he was making his pitch to be Prime Minister. As one of his last things as Chancellor, he did a big review of copyright. Immediately, he stopped being Prime Minister. David Cameron announced a review of copyright. And now it's the European Commission's turn, and we're currently in the middle of yet another review of copyright. The issue being, now we have so much technology, now so much content is available in so many different ways, is it possible to redefine the balance between the rights of the owners of copyright and the rights of the users? I put up there the various people currently involved in a very large effort ever since Juncker got involved to redefine copyright and the balance of it as part of what he refers to as a digital single market. And there's four main players at the moment. There's Juncker, who's the president. There's Ansip, who is ex-Estonian MP, who is the vice president of the digital single market. And there's Wessing, who is commissioner for digital economy and society. And between the three of them, they are hatching up a new approach to copyright, which they're about to launch. There's been a leak today in the FT of possibly what they're going to be doing. In the middle there is Julia Rader, MEP, who has been given the job, she's an EU parliamentarian, given the job being a rapporteur of the review of copyright in this review by Parliament. Ironically, she is the only MEP from the Pirate Party, so the only party that has got a very anti-copyright agenda. And it's a bit like putting the fox inside the hen house or whatever, and maybe the idea is to give her the job because that will draw the sting out of some of the criticisms. In the quote there, you've got the general thrust of what they're trying to achieve, which is there's great technologies and great opportunities from digital technologies, but there shouldn't be any borders, and so we've got to break down national silos. And what they mean by that is you shouldn't have copyright, which if you've got a right to do something in the UK, that shouldn't stop you having the right to do it in France, Germany, or wherever. Before moving on, just look at our poll responses. Quite surprisingly, I think quite surprisingly, we've got a neat 25%, 75% split, which may mean that only 4 people voted, but thank you those 4 people. Should all IP laws be dealt with by Brussels? Yes, 25%. I would have thought that would be much higher. no 75%. And I'd be very interested to drill down to see why that is. Because I think increasingly, as I said before, they are dealt with by Brussels, and they are harmonised, and it is a big factor in international trade. And if you don't have them being dealt with by Brussels, then you haven't been dealt with in a piecemeal way, and you create barriers. Moving back to the copyright debate, where we are with that, there's a picture of Julia Rader and the firefighting logo. She made a report, having done a survey that some 5,000 consumers replied to, saying that they wanted to access their content in more countries than they currently could. And based on that, she suggested all sorts of things to try and liberalise copyright, to reduce its protection, and to increase the number of exceptions to copyright and how this could be used. It's fair to say that her proposals haven't been met with unanimity or unanimous support by Parliament. Within a couple of weeks, they had taken something like 500 proposed amendments to her report, and it's only about 12 pages long. So you can see there's going to be a lot to be done in terms of where to come out with that. Going back to the two guys who are dealing with this from the Commission level, ANSIP seems completely obsessed with borderless EU and removing geo-blocking, which is how you block content from going outside a particular country online. So he's, I suppose you could say, somewhat anti, or seems to be somewhat anti the current way of controlling copyright. Whereas Oettinger is an ex-politician from the German car manufacturing areas, and he's very concerned about protecting EU industries from, in particular, US technology companies. And so there's a bit of a tension, I think, between where they're both going there and where it's going to end up. Next steps, briefly on that, the Parliament, as I said, is debating the Rader report, and there'll be a report out of Parliament saying what should happen about copyright. Meanwhile, ANSIP is publishing a digital market plan, and that's supposed to be this month, and already it's been leaked today in the FT. And the leak says that the European Commission, or includes that the European Commission is going to launch a separate probe into how online platforms list search results and how they use customer data. So that potentially is going to impact how platforms make content available and copyright protection on it. And also, they say, could also bring in stricter rules for video-on-demand services such as Netflix and messaging apps like WhatsApp. So there may be more kind of Fortress Europe stuff going on, and there may be a rebalancing of the current copyright section. Oettinger is going on the same lines. Although at first they were saying there's going to be this fabulous new copyright law which will apply everywhere, he's already started to say, well, actually, maybe it won't apply to the way the film industry distributes things, and it may not apply to the way sports industry works. He may still get national barriers in place. And if that happens, well, what happens to the anti-geo-blocking plans? We'll see. I think what we're going to end up with all of this is we're going to have greater harmonisation of copyright law, but not in a particularly profound way. We're going to have exceptions being the same everywhere, so the way you can use things for parody, etc., is going to be the same everywhere. There may be less geo-blocking, but I think they're going to let the market lead things. So already there are technological solutions which companies are adopting to try to have better control of what is accessed where, but also allowing users to do what they want. And I don't think we're going to get, despite what the Green Party might want or anyone else, we're not going to get any change to how long copyright lasts. I suppose one of the slightly depressing things about there being a new UK government is that it may not happen immediately, but almost certainly within a year or so of there being some kind of stable government, there will be a new review of IP laws. That's my prediction. The last one, they said this would be the only one with Parliament. It took up the entire time of the whole Parliament. So I don't think we can be particularly reassured there won't be anything. And as I mentioned, as I said, there's this Commission leaked report that things are going to change. That was all I was going to say about IP reform and the election protection IP. And now I think we're going to deal with some questions which have been coming in.
Yes, so I need to probably kick off here, but the first question we've got that's come in is one, I think, for me, which is do I think that any of the major political parties that are going to, at any time, reverse the what are referred to as the budget freedoms, the changes to pensions that I was talking about earlier. As I said, of course, nobody's looking to reverse them now. Even parties that you think might be along those lines have not suggested to. And I think that's because at the moment the perceived political wisdom is that because this was presented as giving people freedom and that it's patronising, is the exact word that George Osborne used, to think that people don't know what's best for them. It's very hard, the perceived wisdom is it's very hard to counter that you look bad by suggesting actually maybe people don't know what's best for them. Even if in some circumstances perhaps they don't. Even if some of the decisions they don't know the answer to because they're moving out of a risk-sharing environment into an individual risk environment because the risks are unknown and none of us actually know exactly how long we're going to live. So at the moment nobody is going that way, and it doesn't surprise me or I think anyone else in the pensions industry that no one is going that way at the moment. Whether people will in the future, I simply don't know. I think certainly already there are some comments coming through in the press and some of the changes that have come in or things that have been looked at both by the Financial Conduct Authority and things that have been pushed in the way of the pensions regulator that seem to imply that there is an understanding that this actually may not be the best thing for everyone and that there are risks. The pensions industry is very haunted by the fact that about 20 years ago, actually I like to say 20 years ago because that makes me feel young, it's more like 25 years ago, everyone was encouraged by liberalisation of the pensions industry to consider whether it would be right for them to move from their defined benefit occupational pension scheme that their employer contributes to into a defined contribution one that their employer doesn't contribute to on the grounds it was more portable. And as a result, there was the pensions mis-selling scandal of several people having been sold things that, in retrospect, clearly weren't the right thing. Now, we're not talking about that kind of situation here where clearly people have done something, might do something that wouldn't be right for them. But we are certainly talking about a situation where there is always a risk that people make a decision that isn't one that in the fullness of time they don't regret. So there is already some sort of noise coming out of the press that there are risks involved and some people may be doing things they shouldn't do or maybe being caught by, frankly, scam artists who are, phoning them up and trying to persuade them to cash in their annuity or to take their pension as a lump sum and invest in their product. And unfortunately, quite often, not always, quite often these people, when you drill down, don't in fact have a product for you to invest in. So there's no question that that's criminal activity, but that there are an awful lot of people with access to the money who may be duped as a result. So do I think people may change it in the future? I think there is a chance if it goes badly. I think if things start to go badly, and I think we all accept there'll be some people who make a mistake, but if there are a lot or it's high profile, if we end up in a situation where a lot of people are not properly catering for their older age because they underestimated how long they were going to live or they gave the money to somebody who shouldn't have been trusted with it, then I think there will be some political power behind making a change. It's worth noting that Australia, which is in fact the only country really that does what we are proposing to do by allowing people to take the whole pot and do what they like with it at retirement. The other examples that George Osborne offered aren't really examples of actual pensions being used in that way. But it's interesting that Australia is actually legislating to move back to what we do at the moment, just as we're moving away from it, which does suggest that there is a timeline after which people review this kind of situation. And that timeline is probably when people start to get old with very little money. And if that happens to a lot of people, if we haven't managed to police it properly in the meantime, then I think there is a good chance someone will roll it back. But that is quite a long way into the future, I would say. I don't know if anybody else has had any questions.
I've had one about whether or not this is time for there to be some kind of independent IP minister. And I know this is something that's come up a few times because we do get changes every time, not just every time we get an election, but about every year we get some new politician put in charge of IP policy without really any hinterland or knowledge of what's gone on. And having said that, I think there's a lot to be said for having somebody who's knowledgeable, a bit like you do in the US, for some of these areas, who does take a long-term view and looks across all policy areas, looks at education, looks at the economy, looks at everything that may be touched by IT. But I think it's pretty unlikely at the moment that governments will want to give up control over those sorts of things. They've got fewer and fewer things they have got any kind of control over. And so I think for the time being, it's going to stay as something governments having their gift, and Prime Minister can announce reviews of every few seconds. So I'm afraid not.
Well, those are all the questions we've had coming in today. And we're coming just up to the hour. I hope you found this useful and interesting. And I'd like to thank Paul and Mark for bearing with me. And
thank you, Rosie.
and thank you all for listening. And do log into any more of our webinars over the coming months. Thanks very much.
Feedback.
Oh yes, and there is a feedback provision. So we would love any feedback you have for today's event. So thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining our session today. This will conclude our webinar for today.